So today we're going to be learning about how the Allies win the war in Europe. And then tomorrow we'll worry about how we win the war in Japan. So to start off with, we're going to be looking at the text. So if you have your text packet, I would follow along. And what you want to look for is important information about what things are going on as we win the war in Europe. Okay, so I'm going to start and you should follow along either on the computer screen or in your text packet. Beginning on page 782, it says, when Adolf Hitler learned of the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor, he was delighted. Now it is impossible for us to lose the war, he predicted. We have we now have an ally who has never been vanquished in 3,000 years. Although Germany's alliance with Japan did not require it, Hitler promptly declared a war on the United States. So Hitler thought, oh man, we're good because Japan never loses. And so now that America is trying to fight against Japan, we're good to go. On the next page, it says the Allies suffer early defeats. At first, Hitler's prediction looked as if it might come true. In early 1942, the situation looked bleak for the Allies. German armies occupied most of Europe and much of North Africa. The German war machine seemed unbeatable. German submarines were sinking ships faster than the Allies could replace them. Most of Europe was in Axis hands. Meanwhile, Japan was sweeping across Asia and the Pacific. American forces were divided between two fronts. It was not until 1943 that the tide of the battle turned. It took time for the Allies to develop new strategies, weapons, and forces to fight back Hitler and win the war in Japan. Germany invades the Soviet Union. In the Soviet Union, German armies were closing in on Moscow, Leningrad, and Stalingrad during the summer of 1941. The Soviets resisted heroically. They burned crops and destroyed farm equipment so that the Germans could not use them. The harsh Russian winter that followed also greatly hindered the German advance. Still, the German attack caused terrible hardships. During the 900-day siege of Leningrad that began in the fall of 1941, more than 1 million Russian men, women, and children died, mostly of starvation. Japan advances across the Pacific. Meanwhile, Japanese forces were on the move in the Pacific. After the bombing of Pearl Harbor, they seized Guam, Wake Island, Hong Kong, and Singapore. General Douglas MacArthur commanded United States forces in the Southwest Pacific. With few troops, MacArthur had to defend a huge area. He directed American and Filipino troops in the defense of the Philippines and the island of Bataan. They fought bravely against enormous odds. Besieged on land and blockaded by sea, cut off from all sources of help in the Philippines and in America, these intrepid fighters have done all that human endurance could bear. Bataan has fallen, but the spirit that made it stand, a beacon to all liberty-loving peoples of the world, cannot fail. That was a quote from Norman Reeves. In the end, MacArthur was forced to withdraw. However, about 75,000 American and Filipino troops left to defend Bataan were captured. Nonetheless, MacArthur announced from the safety of Australia, I shall return. The Japanese pressed on. They captured Malaya, Burma, and the Dutch East Indies. They threatened India to the west and Australia and New Zealand to the south. The Allies agree on a strategy. To succeed against the Axis power, the Allies had to agree on a strategy. Even before Pearl Harbor, American and British leaders had decided that the Allies must defeat Germany and Italy first. Then they would send their combined forces to fight Japan. Victories in Japan. Adopting a beat Hitler first strategy did not mean abandoning the war in the Pacific. Chester Nimitz, commander of Allied forces in the Pacific, sent a naval task force into the Coral Sea near Java in May 1942. The task force, strengthened by aircraft carriers that had survived the attack on Pearl Harbor, met a Japanese fleet there. After a 3-day battle, the Japanese fleet turned back. It was the first naval battle in history in which the ships never engaged one another directly. All the damage was done by airplanes from the carriers. 1 month later, the United States Navy won a stunning victory at the Battle of Midway. American planes sank 4 Japanese aircraft carriers. The battle severely hampered the Japanese offensive. It also kept Japan from attacking Hawaii again. Pushing across North Africa. Allied forces began to push back the Germans in North Africa. In October 1942, the British won an important victory at El Alamein in Egypt. German forces under the control of General Erwin Rommel were driven west into Tunisia. Meanwhile, American troops under the command of Generals Dwight D. Eisenhower, Omar Bradley, and George S. Patton landed in Morocco and Algeria. They then pushed east. Allied armies trapped Rommel's forces in Tunisia. In May 1943, his army had to surrender. The Allies invade Italy. From bases in North Africa, the Allies organized the invasion of Italy. They used paratroopers and soldiers brought by sea to capture the island of Sicily. In early September 1943, the Allies crossed from Sicily to the mainland of Italy. By then, Mussolini had been overthrown as leader of Italy. The Germans, however, still occupied much of Italy. In a series of bloody battles, the Allies slowly fought their way up the peninsula. On June 4, 1944, Allied troops marched into Rome. It was the first European capital to be freed from Nazi control. The Eastern Front. The Soviet army repelled the Germans from Leningrad in 1943. At Stalingrad, after months of fierce house-to-house fighting, Soviet soldiers forced the invading German army to surrender. Slowly, the Soviet army pushed the remaining German forces westward through Eastern Europe. Fighting in Russia and Eastern Europe was fierce. The Soviet Union would eventually lose some 9 million soldiers during the war, more than any other country. For years, Stalin had urged Britain and the United States to send armies across the English Channel into France. Such an attack would create a second front in Western Europe and ease pressure in the East. However, not until 1944 were Churchill and Roosevelt prepared to attempt an invasion of Western Europe. Operation Overlord. Years of planning went into Operation Overlord, the code name for the invasion of Europe. General Eisenhower was appointed commander of Allied forces in Europe. He faced an enormous task. He had to organize a huge army, ferry it across the English Channel, and provide it with ammunition, food, and other supplies. By June 1944, almost 3 million troops were ready for the invasion. The Germans knew that an attack was coming, but not when or where. To guard against the Allied invasion, they had mined beaches and strung barbed wire along the entire French coastline. Machine guns and concrete anti-tank walls stood ready to stop an advance. D-Day. In France, in the early morning of June 6, 1944, D-Day, as it was known, a fleet of 4,000 Allied ships carried the invasion force to France. Allied airplanes dropped thousands of paratroopers into occupied France. Gliders landed in the French fields to deliver yet more troops and supplies. Allied warships shelled German defenses in preparation for the attack. But most of the invasion came from troop landings on 5 different beaches along Normandy. Allied troops scrambled ashore, with particularly tough resistance at a location codenamed Omaha Beach. Before the attack was over, 2,400 American casualties resulted at Bloody Omaha. Eventually, Allied forces captured all 5 beaches. Melvin B. Farrell says, "It all seemed unreal, a sort of dreaming while awake. Men were screaming and dying all around me. I honestly could have walked the full length of the beach without touching the ground. They were that thickly strewn about." Despite intense German gunfire and heavy losses, Allied forces surged on to capture more territory along the coast of France. Every day, more soldiers landed at Normandy to reinforce the advance. However, fighting after D-Day was extremely slow and dangerous due to French farm fields that provided thick cover for the enemy. But the Allied ground troops fought stubbornly and pushed German forces back. The Allied liberation of France continued with the capture of Cherbourg, an important French port, by the end of June. Then the Allies swept east, and on August 25, 1944, they entered Paris. After 4 years under Nazi rule, the Parisians greeted their liberators with joy. Within a month, all of France was free. Germany's defeat. By September, the Allies were moving east toward Germany. However, a shortage of truck fuel slowed the advance. The German counterattack. On December 16, 1944, German forces began a fierce counterattack. They pushed the Allies back, creating a bulge in the front of the lines. During the Battle of the Bulge, as it was later called, the outnumbered American forces held back the Germans. Because of a fuel shortage, Germany was unable to power its tanks through the American defense. This hindered the German forces, allowing the Allies to maintain their ground. The Battle of the Bulge slowed the Allies but did not stop them. While Allied armies advanced on the ground, Allied planes bombed Germany. At night, British airmen dropped tons of bombs on German cities. By day, the Americans bombed factories and oil refineries. The bombing caused severe fuel shortages in Germany and reduced the nation's ability to produce war goods. Roosevelt's death stuns the nation. By mid 1944, the Allied advance in Europe shared headlines in American newspapers with the upcoming election. Breaking the tradition, President Roosevelt ran for a fourth term. His Republican opponent was Governor Thomas E. Dewey of New York. Roosevelt was tired and ill. All that is within me cries to go back to my home on the Hudson, he wrote. Still, he and his running mate, Senator Harry S. Truman of Missouri, campaigned strongly. Roosevelt won more than 54% of the vote. In early April 1945, FDR was on vacation in Georgia. While he was sitting to have his portrait painted, the president complained of a headache. Within hours, he was dead. All over the world, people mourned Roosevelt. His death especially shocked Americans. After 12 years, many could hardly remember any other president. As for Truman, he was faced with the task of taking over a country in the midst of war. I felt like the moon, the stars, and all the planets had fallen on me, he later recalled. Victory in Europe. By April 1945, Germany was collapsing. American troops were closing in on Berlin from the west. Soviet troops were advancing from the east. On April 25th, American and Soviet troops met in Torgau, 60 miles south of Berlin. As Allied air raids pounded Berlin, Hitler hid in his underground bunker. Unwilling to accept defeat, he committed suicide. 1 week later, on May 7, 1945, Germany surrendered to the Allies. On May 8th, the Allies celebrated the long-awaited VE Day, Victory in Europe. So in our next lesson, like I said, we'll find out how we beat the Japanese. But today, let's stick to what happened in Europe. So you have 5 questions to answer. Number 1, how did changes to Allied tactics later in the war turn the tide of the war in Europe in their favor? So how did what they decided to do for their strategies change how they were doing in the war for the better? Number 2, what is D-Day? Number 3, when is D-Day? So give me the month, the date, and the year. Number 4, what is VE Day? And number 5, when is VE Day? Again, the month, the date, and the year. After you have answered those questions, and again, please look back in the reading to answer those questions. Most of the questions are in the end of the reading, but there's a little bit at the beginning about that number 1 question. All right. So after you are done with that, then I want you to go and watch some videos. Okay. So on this next slide after these pictures, you're going to watch these videos. They are linked here. So all you have to do is click on them. They're short videos. One is on the D-Day invasion, the Battle of the Bulge, the death of the president, World War II in HD. VE Day is the topic. And then we have inflatable dummy tanks, my personal favorite. Now, what I need you to do is to write something you learned in that right-hand column. It needs to be a complete thought. So if you need to make it a sentence in order to do that, then do that. But make sure you are writing something you learned. Don't tell me you didn't learn anything. That's not acceptable. Make your best effort to do everything that you can to make this your best work. And I will see you tomorrow.